some confusion. I said, where's the talk going to be? Oh, here in the church. And then all of a sudden there were 3 people here. I went, well, okay, I'm okay with whatever. Then I discovered that you all went to the hall. So thank you. It's good to be here. I'm going to shed. So it's the privilege of my life for nearly 40 years to have worked with gang members, and the day won't ever come where I am closer to God or more noble or have more courage than these folks. They've taught me everything there is to know about how to stand at the margins and to let people alter your heart. You know, there's a vision, especially now, that we need to cling to of wanting the world to look differently, God knows. And so we want to imagine something completely different. We want to imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And to that end, we want to dedicate ourselves to dismantle the barriers that exclude. This is quintessentially what Christians do for a living. And so we listen to Pope Francis, who invites us out to the margins as Jesus did, because that's the only way that the margins will get erased and something wider will happen, something more inclusive. And so we stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, what a privilege it is to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. To stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And to that end, our goal is to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And I suspect if kinship happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we would be celebrating it. And as we stand at the margins, we're always bracing ourselves, because people will accuse us of wasting our time standing at the margins. And the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And so we go to the margins and other voices get heard, which is exactly how it should be. I don't think any of that makes sense that I've just said to you, except for the fact that you believe in a God who loves you without measure and without regret. It is absolutely essential and consequential to kind of refine what kind of God we think we believe in. We've settled for a partial God, and we should hold out for a spacious and an expansive one. Meister Eckhart, the theologian, said, and mystic, used to say that it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. We don't believe that either, because we think that God is eager to express his displeasure with us and shake his head and say, "Oh my God, can't you do anything right?" But thank God that's not the God we have. I had a spiritual director once who said, "You know, we need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, because we've settled for this tiny, puny God, and there's just no hope that whatever God you believe in is the God you will act from. If your God is small and judgmental and exacting, you don't have much choice except to be that in the world. And yet ours is a God who extends this tender glance to us. And so we receive that tender glance and we choose to be tender in the world because that's how consequential our notion of God is. But we've settled for something that's quite partial. Once I was saying Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it was a big old gym, and there were like 500 kids there, and mostly gang members. And so I was vested, and I was sitting on kind of a raised platform and in my little folding chair, and we had these sheets that had the readings in them in English and in Spanish, and you know, so you could read the readings in either language. And I was sitting in my chair, and I closed my eyes, and presiders do this every once in a while, where you close your eyes and you hear the word proclaimed. And so one by one, the homies would get up and do the readings, and the first reading was good, and the second reading was the responsorial psalm, and there was kind of an overabundance of confidence in this guy's voice. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And I looked at and it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because you can connect to the exhausted God. Because if your parents or grandparents and you had the kids, your grandkids over for the weekend, and somebody said, "How was your weekend?" "Oh, I'm exhausted." The grandkids were here, but it's a good tired. You know what good tired means? Where you extend yourself in such a generous, loving way. And the exalted God, after all, is the God clearly invented by human beings. Because every one of us, because we're trying to figure out what it means to be God, every one of us would want to be exalted. And so, you know that you've invented God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. You know, it's kind of the same idea, and you don't want to go there. You want to be able to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, and kind. So you receive the tender glance and you choose to be that in the world. Well, Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission. And it was nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. And at the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. And we had 8 gangs at war with each other in these two little contiguous housing projects, and which was unheard of. Normally housing projects would have 1 gang, period. We had 8. And so the LAPD deemed my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere. And I didn't know that when I arrived for the first time in 1984. But I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 254th a week ago, a young man named Jeremy. He was 14 years old. So we did a lot of things. The first thing we did was we started a school because we had so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, so they were wreaking havoc in the projects. They were writing on the walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. And so I walked out to them and I would kind of isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, "Hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one of them said, "Yeah, you know, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so it kind of forced my hand. And So across the street from the church is our parochial school, our elementary school, grades K to 8, occupying the first 2 floors. And but the entire 3rd floor was the convent where the nuns lived. And so one evening I gathered all the sisters in the living room and I sat them down and I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And it was just this little group of Belgian nuns, and they looked at each other and they went, sure. And that was the sum total of their entire discernment process. And so we were off and running, and gang members came in large numbers from all of the 8 gangs to this school because no school would take them. And oh, baby, was it a tough place. I mean, I had many teachers who lasted exactly 1 day. And I had a principal who only lasted a day, and then when I called him to find out where he was, he had changed his number. It was quite an intense place, and fights all the time. And this created something of a disconnect with parishioners. They'd sidle up to me and they'd say, hey, aren't churches supposed to be, hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out? Which I thought was a good gospel challenge. And so in no time at all, the gang members started to say, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, and the profile of the parishioners were mainly women with children who lived in the projects. Myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers. And so that wasn't so forthcoming, so we had to do something because gang members were willing to leave this behind. So we invented things, a landscaping crew, a maintenance crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members. Then in 1992, after the unrest that followed the Rodney King verdict, every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles exploded, except for the poorest pocket, my parish. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was, and so they asked me, and so I said, well, I don't know, maybe it's because, we had 60 strategically hired rival gang members who all had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to ignite their own community. So the article appeared, and the next day a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, read the article, and he summoned me to his Beverly Hills office, and he said, how do you think I should spend my money? And as I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. I was young, I had hair. So I said, across the street from the school is an abandoned bakery. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work, but you could fix them. We could employ rival enemy gang members, put hair nets on them, and they could bake bread, and we could call the place Homeboy Bakery. So that was the extent of my business plan. And so he said sure. So we were off and running once again. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name. We had previously called our effort Jobs for a Future, and we changed it to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. And not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful, but who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And so nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we've backed our way into now we're the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on our planet. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our headquarters in Chinatown, downtown Los Angeles, wanting to reimagine their lives. The centerpiece of what they're hoping for, of course, is our 18-month training program, which is a paid gig. But we really are more concerned about healing. There was a kind of a notion in the early days of Homeboy, when nothing stops a bullet like a job was our motto. But about 15 years in, and we're 34 years old now, we kind of shifted because we started to realize that an employed gang member may or may not go back to prison, or an educated one may or may not. But then it became our absolute guarantee and contention that a healed gang member will not ever reoffend, period. And so we kind of dedicated ourselves to that. We have free tattoo removal. No place on the planet removes more tattoos than we do. We have anger management therapists for everybody, classes, all sorts of self-help things, Criminals and Gangs Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, parenting. We expect everybody there to kind of pursue their own education, even if it's remedial reading or GED or go on to community college. We have 10 social enterprises, Homeboy Diner in City Hall. We have a restaurant at LAX, Homeboy Electronic Recycling, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Bakery, Homegirl Cafe, Homeboy Merchandise. I'm sure I'm missing some. Farmers markets, and the like. Every gang member walks through our doors with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't really calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. Every gang member walks through the doors barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. We receive the tender glance from God, and we choose to be that in the world. Homie, especially now, we have so many lifers who have finally been released, and people have done 30 years, 25 years in prison. They always say to me, you know, we're used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen. If you're watched, you're invisible. If you're seen, you are somebody. The Buddhists always say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." So you want to see people. I remember years ago I had a homie who I met in Houston after a talk I gave, and he was a gang member working with gang members as a hardcore gang intervention worker on the streets of Houston. And he kind of pleaded with me, very earnest guy. He said, "How do you reach them?" Meaning gang members. And I said, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? Can you receive who they are? Can you see them, O nobly born? Remember who you really are. In the Christmas Carol it says, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared, and the soul felt its worth." And yet it's a song about Christmas, and yet it's a song about Jesus. But how is it not the job description of everyone in this church? You appear, and the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. Marcus Borg, the great scripture scholar, says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. I think that's quite right. And the task at Homeboy for all of us is to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that keep people from seeing their truth. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up, mainly because our exhausted God never does this. Instead, we hold the mirror up and we return people to themselves and we say, "Oh, nobly born, look at this. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you." And then you watch as people become that truth. You watch as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. And I'd like to think that Jeremy Galvan, the 14-year-old kid who was gunned down in front of Evergreen Park, who I buried a week ago, knew that he was what God had in mind when God made him. And even death is afraid of that truth. The Acts of the Apostles has a very odd little line in it, and it says simply, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all, including this one, including this city, including this state and country, it suggests that the measure of health may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So years and years ago, I was invited to speak in Richmond, Virginia, to 600 social workers at what they call a gang in-service. So it's 9 to 5, they commandeer a hotel ballroom. Social workers sign up, they get credits. So there are keynotes, workshops, breakout sessions. I'd done a lot of these over the years. So I said yes, and I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pull out the original letter inviting me, and to my horror, I discover that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I found myself saying to myself, as the homies say, "Oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker from 9 to 5. And so I quickly invite in 2 homies, Andre, an African-American gang member, and Jose. And the 2 of them were from rival gangs, and they were in our 18-month program. They were in our, their 9th month or so. And so I sit them down and I said, "Look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time." Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and he's about 25 years old at the time, been to prison, tattooed. At that juncture, we kind of divide everything up in phases. He was in this phase where he had become a very valued member of our substance abuse team. A man solid in his own recovery. Now he was helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only had he had his stretch in prison, he had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." Honest to God, I've never seen this. We got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. And then he continued, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his ability to speak, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to be in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. In the original covenantal language, God says to God's people, as I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God identifies these subgroupings of the poor because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these are the folks who happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead us to the kinship of God, where we allow ourselves to be reached by them. These are the folks society says we can live without you. We stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. And in all, we want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. 4 things. They are the marrow of the gospel. It is how we put first things recognizably first, and it is how we live as though the truth were true. Let me end with one last story so I can sign those thousands of books. The name of my book is called The Whole Language, and the title comes, The Whole Language, The Power of Extravagant Tenderness. And there's a homie who works at our place. Everybody, his name is David, but they all call him Russian Boy. And it's because he came to this country when he was like 6 from Uzbekistan. And there was a homie named Louis Mora who was telling me that he and David, Russian Boy, were locked up together at Men's Central Jail. And he said, damn, gee, every evening he'd go out onto the payphone and he'd talk to his mom. And he talked Russian. Damn, he spoke the whole language. And it's because he didn't know what the word was for that, namely, he was fluent. We all want to be fluent so that you can appear and the soul feels its worth, and people can be reminded that they are nobly born. In the old days, I would ride my bike in the middle of the night to the 8 gang territories. I would patrol. I'd be on my big old clunky black beach cruiser, and I would, kind of go to each neighborhood. And I can't believe now, because I'm a geezer and I go to bed early, but I'd be up till past midnight, and I'd be, put that Uzi down, or sure you want to shoot that guy, stuff like that. And so one night I was in Aliso Village very late, and I was talking to like these 8 guys in a darkened archway in the projects, and I could look over to the dimly lit parking lot, and I could see this kid we all called Bandit, and he had just run up to a car, and he was selling crack cocaine, which is what they did in those days. And then he walked back to the group, and he didn't know that I had arrived, and I wish I could say that he was, embarrassed as he counted his money, but he wasn't so much. In recovery, alcohol recovery or drugs, in gangs it's the same thing. They'll say it takes what it takes, and for gang members to kind of deem it time to stop and to ask for help, it takes what it takes. The birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison, it takes what it takes. I have no idea what it took for this kid, Bandit, to walk through my doors, but he had always avoided doing it until he did it. And he said what gang members often say, I'm tired of being tired. And so he began his 18 months with us. He transformed his pain so he didn't have to transmit it anymore. He came to terms with what was done to him as a kid and also what he had done. And he gained a certain kind of resilience. He became a sturdy soul. And he found the place to be something of a sanctuary. And then he became the sanctuary that he sought. And then he went home to his kids, and he provided that sanctuary, and suddenly you broke a cycle. And of course, after the 18 months, like everybody there, we sent him off, knowing that the world would throw at him what it would, but this time he wouldn't be toppled by it. And so we have a whole team of employment services people, job developers, who are always trying to make the transition seamless from our 18 months to the next job. And so they did, and he went to a warehouse job, an entry-level job. Well, after 5 years at this warehouse, he was running the warehouse, and then another 3 years later, he had been elevated and promoted to an even higher place. And he married his childhood sweetheart, and he bought a home, and he had 3 daughters. Well, I hadn't heard from him in a long time, and no news is good news with gang members. And until he called me on Friday afternoon, there was a little bit of panic in his voice, and he said, "Gee, you got to bless my daughter." I said, "¿Qué pasó, mijo? What happened? Is she sick? Is she in the hospital?" I said, oh, no. On Sunday, she's going to Humboldt College. Imagine my Jessica, my 18-year-old, but she's a little chaparrita, and Humboldt's far, and we're scared for her. Do you think you could give her a blessing before she goes? I go, oh my gosh, of course. Look, tomorrow Saturday, I have baptisms at 1. Why don't you come at 12:30 and we'll do a little send-off? And sure enough, right at 12:30, there they were, Bandit and his wife and the 3 girls, including tiny little Jessica, and we stood in front of the altar, and I said, let's encircle her with our bodies and our love, and everybody touch her, and go ahead, put your hands on her shoulders, on her head, go ahead. And I told them to close their eyes and to bow their heads, and as the homies say, I do a long-ass prayer. I go on, and somewhere in the middle of this prayer, I noticed that we've all become chillones. We're all just weeping. Ugly kind of weeping, crying. I don't know why we're crying, but we're all crying. I think it's because Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's ever gone to college except me. Certainly nobody in their families. So trying to change the subject, we laugh about how mushy and we're wiping our eyes. And so I look at little tiny Jessica. Hey, what are you going to study at Humboldt College? And she was very quick, forensic psychology. I go, damn, forensic psychology? And Bandit over here chimes in, yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind. And she deadpans, looks at her father, and she does one of these, and he sees her and he laughs and he says, yeah, I'm going to be her first subject. So we go out to the car and big abrazos, and they pile into the car. And Bandit hangs back, and I'm so glad he has. And I look at him and I say, hey, can I tell you something? I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become, for choosing to walk in your own footsteps. I'm proud of you. And his eyes fill up with tears, and so do mine, and we watch as lone tears escape and roll down our cheeks. And it seems a long time before he can say anything until he does. And he says, you know what? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a bueno para nada, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them. Yeah, I guess you did. And the soul feels its worth. Oh, nobly born. Remember who you really are. You don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the widow, orphan, and stranger make you different. Till you appear and the soul feels its worth. And it's after no time at all you begin to cease to care if anyone accuses you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you all very much.